Hi, and welcome to another episode of Apes and Pants with me, Sean Coffey, and Chris Brennan. Thanks for joining us today as we explore the whys and wherefores of human behavior. For more information on this episode and to learn more about what we do, visit us at adultacademy.org/apes and pants. Chris, what are we doing today?
Sean, we're going to focus on two things. First, we're going to discuss why we need to define an ethos, a culture of norms and practices to guide our lives. And second, we're going to talk about the first of 6 values that you and I hold as essential. Stick with us.
It is now time for Apes in Pants.
Apes and Pants.
Sit down and won't shut up. Most of all, I will not grow up.
I think ethos might be one of your favorite words. It's interesting for sure, because I don't think we use it every day. Why do you use the word ethos as opposed to anything else? Ethics, morality, a philosophy. What's the difference here?
Well, and I think I touched on this a little bit in episode 2, but the first reason that I use it is because it is a word that we don't use all the time. So it's a word that forces people to have to stop and think about what's being discussed a little bit more. I think we all have a few more sort of implicit assumptions about what we mean when somebody says a philosophy or what morality is or what ethics are. Like, there's a lot of ingrained implicit assumptions that go into that. Whereas ethos, because it's a word that we don't use all the time, I think forces us to have to come back and look at, okay, what's actually being talked about. And then there's two aspects of this, and it's really the two different ways that we can define an ethos and how those intermesh with one another. The first, and sort of the dictionary definition, and it's the one that I like the best, is that, an ethos is the fundamental character, the guiding beliefs of a group or an individual. And that idea that it is the guiding beliefs is first and foremost one of the things that I think it makes us think about. The second thing comes directly from Aristotle and the notion of rhetoric and the use of the term ethos and rhetoric to define the credibility of a speaker, of a writer, of a presenter. And I think that these two things are tied together because the credibility of any authority, and I use authority in scare quotes purposefully, is that ideally anyone's authority ought to be derived from their ethical behavior. So if we use those two notions of ethos together, that of our character and beliefs and the authority that we have, the credibility that we have because of our character, then what we have is this notion that we should be examining the beliefs, both spoken and unspoken, of those we consider authorities, and we should be using the spoken especially, but certainly both the spoken and unspoken aspects of their character to determine their credibility.
Okay, so why does defining this matter? What it has to go a little bit deeper. I mean, and you went into it quite a bit here with going around ethical behavior. I mean, people have an idea of what ethics are. They understand, I think, on some levels, their own morality and their own moral compass, but why define it?
Well, anything that's not defined can't be measured, right? So it's the same reason that you write down your workouts, because if it's not if it's not measured, it's not managed. But in the same vein, if it's not defined, then you don't know what to measure to begin with. So if I say, so we say that our mission is to make the world a better place. Well, that's a pretty open-ended statement, right? That could mean a lot of things. And if you are somebody who is motivated out of a massive level of self-interest, then for you, making the world a better place may mean manipulating everyone around you in such a way as to serve your own aims. So you can't just leave with this broad statement, which is where we then come to this next phase of us defining our ethos, which is saying that we do this, we make the world a better place through encouraging and enabling the 6 virtues that we hold to, those virtues of empathy, of agency, of mutual aid, of self-reliance, of resilience, and of kindness. So now, by defining those 6 things for people, we've now begun to narrow down the terms of what making the world a better place includes for us. So now, not only can we speak to what our belief system is, but we can check our belief system, right? If you and I decide that we're going to go off and start engaging in a topic or engaging in a piece of instruction or whatever, we in our heads can come back to, does this fit into our mission? Does this fit into our ethos? Because we've defined it. And in the same vein, our audience, the folks that are listening to this or watching this or reading our content, coming to our workshops, those folks can say, well, what they just said either doesn't sit well with me, or I don't know what they mean, or what, if there's something that brings them an issue, then they can go, okay, well, how does this fit in to those things that they've said that are part of their ethos?
So we don't really set it up as a list, if you will, a tier of 1, 2, 3, whether we label it accountability, our values, ethics. However, to me, it feels like a circle, because I could have a gap somewhere in my moral compass, or I could have a break where for some reason I kind of lost my way, if you will. But I can always kind of come back to it if I'm on a circle, right? I can back up, I can go around. I'm not going to be able to circumvent it like I could a list. If I put something way down on my list and I determine that it should be ranked at number 8, I can skip it and get down to it. But I think in a circular fashion, these things kind of hold us a little bit more accountable. It gives us that flexibility in between to say, you know what, we're going to hold ourselves accountable. This is how we're going to run things. This is what our mission is. And I guess for me, it's putting it in this context allows a little bit more growth. I think the list kind of takes away. I feel like a circular way about this is a little bit more effective.
Yeah, absolutely. Anytime you use a checklist for something, as soon as the box is checked, you're done with it, right? That check means I have accomplished this and I can move on. I no longer have to revisit this. So yeah, I think you're absolutely right. What we're talking about is a lived, applied philosophy. And it's something that requires coming back and examining where we sit in terms of all the aspects of that lived, applied philosophy on a day-to-day basis. I think that in that vein, it's worth talking about the fact that there's also in individual philosophies, there's this notion of normative values, right? So normative meaning the norms that we wish to be held to, or that we think others should be held to, the instructive values. And there's a lot of times in life where we don't state them, right? There are a lot of times in our work lives, in our parenting lives, in our day-to-day lives, where we don't explicitly say what our values are. Or
are they different than unwritten rules?
No.
Unwritten rules of the road, unwritten rules of baseball. two things that come to my mind are driving and baseball.
Sure. No, I think they're very much the same thing. And I think that the big thing to keep in mind is that it's unreasonable to expect someone to adhere to an unwritten rule. Because the virtue of defining things, and I use the word rule loosely here. I'm an anarchist at heart. I don't like a whole lot of rules because I think that rules become the way I've always put it is this. If you have a job and there's a rule at your job, you know whose name is on that rule. That rule exists because somebody did something that upset a higher up, and now there's a rule in place that says if there's no school on Monday, you can't hook a personal day up with it on Friday.
So how many times were you the reason for a safety brief at work?
It has happened. There have certainly been rules. In my fire service career in particular, I once had to write a letter of apology and have it published because of a statement I had made in a publication. And after that, none of my biographical details ever included what department I worked for after that. All of my bios simply said, Christopher Brennan is a firefighter in the suburbs of Chicago.
Couldn't be associated with the actual township.
I refused to censor my opinion based upon a governmental body's belief systems, but I also respected that they didn't necessarily want me invoking their name in that case. So I solved that problem. But yeah, no, there's absolutely been rules written that have my name on them. And in the same vein that we shouldn't be creating useless rules, I also think that if you don't have a couple of rules that have your name on them, you're probably not trying real hard in life. You're not pushing the boundaries. But so in general, I think that unwritten rules simply set people up for failure. Because if you have an expectation, so a lot of what we talk about and focus on is parenting and mentoring and teaching. Well, if I have an expectation for my child, but I haven't made that expectation explicit, how can I hold them to it? Conversely, now, and this is where it gets challenging, I think, sometimes, is that when we define our ethos, when we define our culture, when we define our values, when we define our expectations, that takes a lot of critical self-reflection. It takes a lot of effort to sit down and say, here's what really matters. Here are the things that I'm going to care about. Here are the things that I need you as my child, you as my spouse, you as my business partner, you as my students, whatever. If I say, here are my expectations, I got to sit down and think about those in advance. But once I've done that, and once I've communicated them to you, now we have a frame of reference to talk about. Now we have a frame of reference to come back to for me to say, you're doing it right, you're doing it wrong, or more importantly, okay, how does that line up with what we already talked about? Is that in furtherance of our ultimate aims and goals? And that's the beauty of definitions, is that it helps reduce some of those gaps in understanding, and it gives us the space to say, oh, wait a minute, I actually need to think about that more. I need to pin that down a little bit more because I've got this vague notion about what is, you have to put the dishes away before you go to bed at night. Why? Well, why?
Yeah,
because I don't like getting up to a sink full of dishes in the morning. Okay, that's all I need to know.
And the old way was always the way that things were done in my house when I was a kid. It was, well, because I said so.
Absolutely.
That because I said so is.
Well, it's a lazy answer.
It's yeah, because there's nothing good. Well, there's nothing worthwhile behind it.
Right.
There's no.
Yeah, and again, I'm not a big authority for the sake of authority guy. I believe authority and respect have to be earned. I've said this from the get-go. My child does not owe me respect because I am his father. If I do not treat him in a respectful way, he doesn't owe me respect. He might owe me subservience. But why? Because I'm threatening not to feed him? Or I'm threatening to hit him? Well, those are both just applications of violence. That's not respect. That's fear. I mean, and admittedly, for many years, I used a combination of Machiavelli's The Prince and Homer Simpson as my parenting models. I didn't find that those worked great overall. I had to change a few things.
Our ethos is made up of 6 values: empathy, agency, mutual aid, self-reliance, resilience, and kindness. If we're going to talk about these things and hold ourselves accountable and expect others to hold us accountable, then we need to explain what we mean by these 6.
Yeah, for sure. You have to define your terms, which is what we've been talking about so far. That if we don't do that, we are doing a disservice to people that are trying to follow along with our work, that are trying to apply the things that we're talking about. I have zero patience for people who use ambiguity and smoke and mirrors and vagueness to either try and lure people in to the work that they're trying to do, or what I think happens as often is cover up gaps in their own understanding of what they're trying to do.
Buzzwords, they become filler.
It becomes
things
filler.
They don't even.
And the thing is, none of what we are doing here is magic. That's why it's the logo. That's why it's part of our. That's why our motto is it's not magic. None of what we are doing here, when talking about parenting and mentoring and educating and making the world a better place, none of the things that we believe are involved in that are magical. They are all concrete realities that any single person who is willing to invest the time and the effort can accomplish. There's no tricks. There's nothing to it other than good old-fashioned effort. And everything that we're talking about as practices can be done by anybody who is willing to act intentionally and hold themselves accountable.
Well, so let's go back to the it's not magic part. When we first got together and we're going through this, the name came, the motto, it's not magic. And I remember, I was like, the unicorn? Really? The unicorn? And, you said something that made a whole lot of sense, and it's something that I know I have done in the past. I just never labeled it. We take what we do seriously. We don't take ourselves seriously. I think some people probably, it's not magic, the unicorn. And I was sold. It fit. I want to do what I do. I want to do it with resolve. I want to have a plan. It's not going to be willy-nilly, but it's not going to be so serious as to take away from it's. I'm just not going to be that serious about me. What I do is going to be serious.
Absolutely. Well, and I think that is something that in being in, sort of our principal audience, right? Parents, mentors, and educators. I think that there is a tendency, you and I have both seen it in people,
Teachers
of all stripes, to anybody that fits into those parents, right? They take themselves seriously. To me, taking yourself seriously but not taking what you do seriously means that you expect respect and deference without showing any respect to your child or your student or your mentee. It means expecting somebody to hop up and go do something the second you tell them to do it, but you can't be bothered to put down Candy Crush. That's somebody who takes themselves seriously but doesn't take what they do seriously. I have absolutely no problem with the level of grief that my 16-year-old will give me, for the simple reason that he learned it by watching me. I'm a smart aleck. I give people grief all the time. Why does he give me grief? Because he sees me do it. So I would be an utter hypocrite if I wasn't able to roll with it a little bit and play with it. And that said, because I'm willing to roll with it a little bit, when I do say, okay, stop, this is something that we need to actually deal with, that goes away. I have taken that kid and said, okay, here's the day that you learn how to clear and safe a handgun. And he stands there at the position of parade rest and pays attention because he knows that this is not a time when we're joking around. The same thing happened when I taught him how to use a table saw. Okay, this is serious. Now we're on point.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I want. That's taking what you do seriously. That's taking the relevant things seriously.
So in order to kind of take away whatever front, whatever facade that you have, and kind of say, all right, I'm going to do something seriously, not me. I know that when I was in the classroom and I was teaching, one of the things that I really felt that I did well was I could say to a student something that I could be embarrassed. I could come down off of that perceived authority figure, that ladder that I had to be on top of, and it never fit for me. What I always tried to do was to understand where those kids were coming from. I could take away whatever I had going on that day, and I just really tried to say, all right, I have to look at this kid in the face. I have to figure out what's going on with him or her, and begin to understand where they were coming from, which is going to lead us right into this first
point one
of empathy. And so we go back to accountability and defining.
Yeah.
What is it? What is empathy?
Okay, so empathy is looked at in a couple of different ways. I like the definition that Frans de Waal, who's a primate biologist and a primatologist, I suppose I should say, and Stephanie Preston set up, which is, quote, the emotional and mental sensitivity to another state, end quote. And it's a stunningly simple definition, but it takes those two critical functions of empathy into consideration. Affective empathy, feeling what somebody else is feeling, and cognitive empathy, understanding what another person is feeling. And you hit on a really important point in what you were starting off with there, and that is that in order to be empathetic, we have to be vulnerable. We have to let another person's worldview in, and that can be challenging, right? So if we're trying to see the world from another person's perspective, we have to be open to the fact that our perspective is not the only one that exists. And I really think that on the topic of vulnerability and how it relates to empathy, everyone would do well to check out Brene Brown's work. She's a PhD sociologist who has written a few books. She's given a couple of TED Talks. They're on YouTube. They're on TED.com. Her book, Daring Greatly, is an absolutely phenomenal resource for this, and it's a great starting point. And ultimately, that's what that idea of taking what you do seriously but not taking yourself seriously is. It's being willing to be vulnerable. It's being willing to say, "Oh, I don't know. Oh, I had never thought about that way before. Tell me why you think that. Tell me why you feel that way." And trying to really see it from their perspective.
That concept and that idea, that I know, is still very difficult for teachers to do.
It's very hard for people to do, to engage with another person empathetically. Think about every fight that you have ever had with a loved one, whether it's a parent, a child, a spouse. Anytime that somebody came at you with something that incited a disagreement, at the core of that, there is a lack of empathetic engagement. There is a lack of seeing things from the other person's point of view.
Underneath that, is it just a matter of listening? Do we not listen enough? Because I come back to the listening thing. I think just something current events wise, state of the world, however you want to look at it, I just feel that we don't listen to one another anymore. Is it just as simple as opening your ears and listening? How do you get How do you get to that level of empathy?
So maybe that's a practical way of trying to get to it. I think what underlies the lack of listening is the lack of willing to be vulnerable. It's the lack of willing to set aside your preconceived notions, your implicit assumptions about a person or an event or some other social condition, right? We have the worldview. It's being unwilling to accept the vulnerability of setting aside our worldview to listen to the other person or to examine what the other person's bringing to the table. The empathetic response is hard because while it is something that is rooted in our evolutionary wiring, it is constantly being held in tension with a lot of our self-preservation instincts, which we talked about in episode 1. It ties, so our self-preservation instincts are tied to fear-based behaviors. Things that we perceive as threats, we respond to with fear. Fear excludes empathy. Any place where fear exists, empathy can't thrive. So in order to engage with people in an empathetic way, we have to be able to detach from our fears. We have to be able to detach from our fear of looking stupid, of not knowing something, of whatever it is that we're afraid of not being the authority. We have to be able to detach from our fear of that and go, take a deep breath. Let me hear what this person has to say. And that's hard. That takes conscious effort. It's not something that we do naturally.
Well, I'm jotting down some notes here, and I keep going back to the classroom, because it was 12 years of my life, my career. I suppose in any authority figure, you really how do you come down off of that? Whether it's a self-imposed perch, whether it's, society gave you that perch to stand up on top of, whatever it may be, how do you come down off of that? Because, and I know we're going to get to these things and we're going to try and get deeper into it and actually figure them out, maybe not necessarily solve them, but, really help people figure out how they can become vulnerable, detach themselves, pick a topic here, current events wise. How do we do it?
Well,
join us next week on episode 4. Sorry, that was a loaded question.
Great teaser. So I think we come back to that same idea of establishing for ourselves what it means to be empathetic and what it doesn't mean to be empathetic. Because I think that the other thing that can get wrapped up in this debate is the idea that empathy equals tolerance. And tolerance is a word that has its own set of loaded assumptions to it. But in this case, I'm using it to mean that tolerance is accepting behavior that you find harmful without question. Now, there's two great debates that we can pin on either side of the tolerance argument and either side of the empathy argument. And on one hand, we have the topic of LGBTQ rights. On the other hand, we have the current trend in the world towards the acceptance of fascist white supremacist viewpoints. Okay? So stick with me. I'm going to try and tie this into a neat little bundle. There are people who would say that any sort of acceptance of LGBTQ rights is a issue of tolerance. That they have to tolerate somebody else's behavior. And I would argue that given what we know as a society about how people's sexual orientation comes about. The fact that I don't know if I'm surprising anybody with this, but it's biological. It's just like the which came first, the chicken or the egg? The egg. The egg has been around in evolutionary history for millions of years longer than chickens were. That question is not a question if you use Google. In the same sense, the question of why does somebody have a preference for same-sex partners, opposite-sex partners, or no preference whatsoever, that's answered. It's the presence of androgens and androgen blockers during gestation. The biology on that has been answered decades ago. There's no room for debate there. So, that being said, all of the fear that's surrounded with LGBTQ rights, this is a morally reprehensible lifestyle. What's that rooted in? Well, that's rooted in religious dogma brought up throughout the centuries. Okay. But it doesn't jive with what we know about human evolution. It doesn't jive with what we know about human psychology. And if you can't catch being gay, somebody kissing a same-sex partner might make you uncomfortable because it doesn't fit within your worldview. It doesn't injure you. Conversely, somebody who is espousing and promoting a white supremacist worldview is seeking to hurt people. They are seeking to limit the rights of fellow human beings. I'm not tolerant of people who are on the LGBTQ spectrum somewhere. I'm empathetic. I can be empathetic to the fears that underlie the white supremacist, but I'm also not going to be tolerant of their beliefs. I'm not going to hold that they have any right to promulgate hateful or actions that are injurious to my fellow man. And I think that that's an important distinction to make, that there is a difference between empathetically engaging with somebody else's worldview. I can attempt to understand the underlying conditions that have brought somebody to a white supremacist worldview without ever agreeing with them or without tolerating their behavior. And that's important to understand, that I can still engage with that person empathetically.
Why are we or aren't we empathetic?
Biology. Empathy is, at the end of the day, whether we are sort of normally empathetic, let's say, or overwhelmed by empathy, or completely lacking in empathy, it's a biological state. So empathy is brought about by our neurochemistry. And we have evolved structures in our brain that respond to our neurochemistry in such a way that when we see another person's emotions on display, we have a similar emotional response. So that has a really important function for us as a species, in that it promotes pro-social behavior. If I see that you are in pain, the physiological response that promotes empathy in me causes me to step in and try and do something to alleviate your suffering. So it really does just come down to the initially comes down to the presence and degree of that presence of our pro-social hormones. So we sort of have 4 hormones that are constantly in play in our neurochemistry. Endorphins, dopamine, serotonin, and oxytocin. And our endorphins and our dopamine are very much the selfish chemicals. They are the ones that make us not feel pain and make us feel great about achieving successes for ourselves. Serotonin and serotonin and oxytocin are the bonding chemicals. So serotonin is what makes us feel happy and content in our environment, and oxytocin is literally the hormone that we secrete in response to feeling bonded to somebody else. So it all comes down to biology. It all comes down to this evolutionary response, right? So we can look at empathy on this spectrum from sort of the average, right? And I'd rather use the word average than norm, because norm brings with it then the idea of normal, which has a value judgment attached to it for most people. So the average, the middle of the bell curve people respond with empathy when somebody else gets hurt. We start doing it as infants. We respond when somebody else is dealing with the situation that's unfair. We respond with empathy when somebody is dealing with a situation where they are experiencing pain or fear or anything like that. And then we can go on that scale one way or the other. I would argue that in a lot of cases, neurotic behavior can be an abundance of empathetic reaction. We put more emphasis on the emotional responses of somebody else and those emotional responses affecting us than is reasonable at times.
Almost as if that person is trying to, and it's a horrible way to put it, but almost as if that person who's being over empathetic is reaching for the same attention they think that person is getting by being hurt or being happy. Is that too far?
No, I don't so much mean that. What I mean is more the idea that, so we talked a little bit about in episode 2 about how, my neurosis in particular. So this may just be me. I may only be speaking about me in this case, but I think it holds true for a wider section of the population, is that if someone responds to something that I've done with anger or disgust or something like that, I take the intensity of their displeasure on so much that I presume that those feelings are valid and they affect my feelings about myself. So not that I'm then seeking attention in any way. Usually what I'm seeking is to go run and hide because I feel so badly about what I've done, even if I shouldn't have felt badly about it. The opposite end of that spectrum is people who do not have effective empathetic regard for others. And there's really two categories of people that fall on the far end of that spectrum, and that's people who are dealing with autism or an autism spectrum disorder and psychopaths. And it is uncomfortable to put those two groups of people into the same conversation, and yet biologically I think it's a relevant position to hold, because what happens is that in Simon Baron Cohen, interestingly enough, Sasha's cousin, Borat's cousin, is a neurologist. I believe he's a neurologist, but he's a psychologist, but he studies empathy. And he published a book which has an awful title called The Science of Evil. That's its title in the US. I don't remember its UK title. But the book itself is phenomenal because it explores this idea of empathetic engagement and sort of the differences between sort of averagely adapted and maladapted empathetic responses. So in both cases, and this is something that I think is going to hold true over time, is that we're going to come to see psychopaths as having as little control over their lack of empathy as we have come to understand that people with autism have over their lack of empathy. So in the case of the autistic person, their lack of empathy is not that they themselves do not feel emotions. It is that they do not perceive the emotion in another. So in some respects, the autistic kid, the autistic adult, that's one of the disconnects that they have to face with the world, is that they don't understand why people are becoming upset. They recognize it when it happens, but they don't anticipate it, so they can't adjust their behavior in advance. Conversely, the psychopath does not experience the emotion. The psychopath is that purely rational person with no fear that we talked about. That's the downside of having a small amygdala, is that you have very few emotional responses, and therefore you don't have empathetic responses either. You are a coldly, calculatingly rational individual. We don't really perceive, that's not really a good thing. Like, we talk a lot about, as a society, we talk a lot about being coldly rational. We talked about this in episode 1. The idea of, well, what if we could just be more rational? The end state of being more rational is seeing people as statistics, not as members of the tribe. And that's not a pro-social condition.
So can you beat the biology, for lack of a better phrase?
I don't know. I wish I knew. I wish if I knew, I'd probably have a Nobel Prize in medicine right now.
But you're not a doctor.
But I'm not a doctor, and I don't play one on the internet or TV. So I think what we can do, though, is we can always teach behavior, right? Behavior can be learned. It doesn't always come implicitly. And what we can do is consciously train our children to be empathetic, to try to respond in an empathetic way. If we expect them to do it perfectly, we are setting them up for failure, because we don't do it perfectly. Nobody does it perfectly. But we can start teaching people to be more empathetic. And one of the ways that we can do that is by approaching the world in a more empathetic way ourselves. So if my first reaction is blustering frustration if somebody cuts me off in traffic, my kid sees that. If my first response is nothing, they may not pick up on it. If my first response is, oh man, that guy cut me off, I hope everything's okay. Maybe he's rushing to his mom's bedside. Maybe she has had car trouble and is rushing to the first job interview that she's had in 7 months. The first thing that happens with that is that we relax a whole lot more. We're not so wound up. The second thing that happens is that we start showing our kids that, hey, everybody else's action, it's not about you. It's about them. And that's okay. They can have the need to engage in self-interested behavior. Them cutting you off in traffic, at best, is probably an inconvenience. It's probably not even that. Now, there's a whole different conversation to be had if somebody is engaging in dangerous behavior, right? If somebody is truly cutting you off and you're slamming on your brakes and they're establishing a dangerous condition, you have every reason to express concern or frustration with that. But at the same time, we still need to try and take a step back and go, well, they probably weren't trying to hit my car, because they would have. Which means they were absorbed in their own little world. We don't want to be absorbed in our own little worlds. We want to try and be engaged in the broader world around us and thinking about others. But we also need to think about the fact that we don't always do it.
So I said earlier, my question to you was, can we beat the biology? I suppose that's answered in and of itself, right? You can't beat the biology. We can learn those behaviors. So how do we start getting better at being empathetic? Because I think that would be the easier question. How do we get better?
Well, I think we get better by the same way we do anything else. We set it in our mind as an intention. We establish for ourselves that we want to engage with the world more empathetically. And then once we have set as our intention, I want to engage with the world more empathetically, then the next thing that we do is we start with trying to catch ourselves when our first response to somebody else's behavior is about how it affects us. If we can learn to catch ourselves and rather than say something to the effect of, I'm angry because this affected me this way, if we can stop and say, I wonder why they did that. I wonder why they cut me off in traffic.
And that's going back to being vulnerable.
Yeah, absolutely. I wonder why they did that. I wonder what's going on in their life. If that is the first question that we can teach ourselves to ask, we are effectively engaging our empathy more. And that's a practical skill. That's a thing that we can choose to do, and we can prime ourselves with it. You can write a note and put it on your mirror that just says, I wonder why they did that. I wonder what's going on in their life. Something to that effect. You can put a note, an alert in your phone that pops up in your calendar a couple of times a day. You can tape it as a Post-it note on your monitor at work, whatever it needs to be. But if you get into the habit of asking that question of, I wonder why they did that, from an open, inquisitive place, not an angry, what's wrong with them place, you start priming yourself to be more empathetic.
And then ultimately, I suppose that's going to lead us right back to, well, I guess that's a segue for next week. If we're going to talk about how do we get better, how do we become willful? We'll talk about agency next week.
Absolutely, agency is the next point that we need to address, and I think it's going to be another good topic.
All right, that's it for this one. Thanks for joining us. We, as always, we want to extend a big thanks to singer-songwriter and all-around awesome dude, Frank Turner, his manager as well. We got to give him a plug because we had a little YouTube farce this week with using his song.
Yeah, Charlie, we appreciate you stepping in and getting that cleared up.
Yeah, absolutely. And Frank for letting us use his song Photosynthesis. Please visit frank-turner.com to check out Frank and his work. Follow the links, iTunes, Amazon. And remember, if you purchase through Amazon, you also support this show.
Yeah, please subscribe to the podcast. Sign up for our email list, which you can do through our website, adultacademy.org, where you'll get notifications of all of our new content. Please share what we're doing here with your friends. Find us on Twitter at adult, ADULT, ACAD. Same on Instagram. You can visit us there. If you are looking for a new t-shirt to wear, you can visit our Teespring store. You can support the show by following the Amazon link on our website to buy anything from cat food to diapers or anything else that you might need. And we really appreciate it. So there is absolutely no more valuable resource that any of us have than our time. And we want to thank you for spending some of your time with us today. Cheers.